Hi, welcome to the inaugural Conspiratus podcast, the show where through discourse and discussion, we attempt to reach consensus on the future of blockchain and distributed systems. I'm Sunny Agarwal.
And I'm Nate Rush. On this very special first episode, we are honored to welcome Arthur Breitman, co-creator of Tezos, and Vlad Zamfir, a researcher at the Ethereum Foundation of the podcast. The topic of this podcast is going to be blockchain protocol governance.
Before getting started, we just want to say we hope all of our readers got a chance to take a look at the reading list that is available on our website. And throughout the podcast, we'll be referencing a lot of the readings that were in that list.
Awesome. Arthur, Vlad, thanks again so much for coming on today. We really appreciate you guys taking the time. Let's start with some introductions. Who are you and what are you working on currently? Arthur, go for it.
Okay, so my name is Arthur Breitman, and I work on a protocol called Tezos. And Tezos is a self-amending blockchain. I would say that's the main particularity of it. And what it means exactly is every blockchain that's out there has had some forks, and it has some change in its algorithm. And generally, it follows a certain ad hoc process in order to do that, where the community kind of get together and say like, hey, we really want this new version, and they all kind of move on to this new version. And my reflection is that the game theory around this, the game theory around like which branch you move to, has a lot more to do with a clout that has to do with merit. And so the idea of Tezos is to say, let's have a formal governance process so that the blockchain can evolve.
Cool. And Vlad?
Yeah, hi, I'm Vlad. I usually work on consensus protocols, but I guess today I'll be wearing my blockchain governance researcher hat. I kind of agree that part of the point of the point of Tezos is put formal, have a very formal kind of governance structure. But I definitely think that that kind of thing is also, it's very possible to have formal governance outside of the blockchain protocol. But I don't know what the organization is, and I don't know if we're meant to just jump right into things.
Cool.
Yeah, why don't we start? Maybe if you guys could kind of give us a succinct summary of, kind of what you think blockchain governance is. I know that's a, fairly big topic, but, maybe a high level overview, a bird's eye overview of kind of the key points of specifically blockchain protocol governance as you guys see it.
Okay, I guess I'll jump in. So to me, blockchain governance has basically, it has to do with the governance of the resources that blockchain kind of depends on. And there's a few of them that I like to focus on. I like to focus on the software repositories that contain the implementations of the blockchain. There might be more than one. They should be consensus compatible, right? And then there are nodes who run implementations of the blockchain. So there's nodes, software repos, and they're kind of governed separately, at least in Bitcoin and Ethereum. And there's also the trademark, which is a kind of more interesting resource. And there's other kind of more peripheral blockchain governance resources mailing lists and Reddit and all that kind of stuff.
So when you talk about resources, so I know Arthur in his talk on governance on our reading list, he talks about this concept of shared resources versus property right resources. Mm-hmm. And so you would call the code base of the blockchain a type of shared resource, as well as the trademark is a shared resource.
I would definitely say that it's a resource that has a lot of stakeholders. A lot of people are impacted by changes to that resource. And so whether or not it's technically owned by GitHub or an organization in a legal title sense, the whole community is impacted by changes to those repositories. At least, if there's a few or if they're important repositories.
I see. All right, cool. And Arthur, could you give us a bit of a summary of what do you think of, how do you define the topic of protocol governance?
Oh, I tend to agree. I think that governance happens whenever you have a shared goal or a shared resource. You have many people who want to either manage a resource together or do something together. And so you end up with either tragedy of the commons, where it's no one's incentive to maintain the common, or the flip side of it, big free riding, where there's already something and you benefit for it without actually paying for it. So it's kind of it happens with something like the code base, for example. So how should the code evolve? Because you want everyone to be using the same resource. However, no one wants to really pay for it. So the way you deal with this in some blockchains like Bitcoin, for example, Bitcoin has a transaction tax and a capital tax in order to pay for all the nodes and all the miners who are going to maintain this blockchain. But that pays for one aspect of it, which is who's going to participate in the consensus algorithm, who's going to allocate bandwidth, and so on and so forth. But there are other aspects like who maintains the code base, who decides on the changes, or simple thing, if you decide, for example, that reaching out, explaining to people what your blockchain is, what it does, teaching people how to use it, and so on and so forth. All of these are shared resources that have a lot of stakeholders, as Vlad mentioned, but which are not directly addressed by existing governance algorithms.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So kind of maybe I'm misinterpreting here, but it seems like one of the distinctions that you guys are making is that, Arthur, you kind of also include like the consensus algorithm, the fees paid to miners as part of governance. And Vlad, you didn't mention that. It's more so about the nodes and the software that they're running. So like, I wonder, do you think that, the consensus algorithm that the protocol runs is related to governance? And kind of as a follow-up to that question, is proof of stake something that, both of you guys are pro, in different variations? Is proof of stake a governance process?
Okay, well, you can, to me, like you could say that a blockchain protocol governs the order of blocks. But when I was talking about like software repositories, like that would, for example, govern things like the issuance schedule. That's like that's like specified kind of, either in, it's ultimately specified in the implementations of the nodes running on the network. So somehow software repositories captures all of the question of what protocol is running, what the economics are.
Yeah, so I don't think I think ideally your consensus algorithm is not governance. Ideally your consensus algorithm should be as predictable and as deterministic as possible, and it should not I think in governance question there's the idea that the problems we're trying to tackle with governance are fuzzier, and the problem that the consensus algorithm is trying to solve is more well-defined. It's like, we want to have consensus, we don't want forks, we want to have finality, we want to have all these properties which are very well-defined from a computer science standpoint. They're not really human problems. So in general, when you speak about governance in blockchain, it's all the fuzzier things that are happening around the ecosystem.
So would it be fair to draw then the distinction between consensus and governance? Governance is things that need some level of human input, while protocol is things that run can be encoded purely in code.
I mean, I think the thing is that most of the time when we look at governance, it's not the case that we just have an objective computer science or solution, right? It's just super rare that you can just verify with like tech or like just pure logic whether something's a correct governance decision. And so most governance decisions don't boil down to, hey, let's run some code. They boil down to lengthy conversations and multi-stakeholder kind of negotiation. Cool.
So that seems like a nice distinction or a nice way of talking about it. I guess a question then is, what is the realm of blockchain protocol governance? Like, what are the stakes here? What are we talking about when we're talking about blockchain protocol governance? And what do you expect, kind of an ideal blockchain protocol governance system to kind of do?
Well, there's several levels. I mean, on the simplest levels, a decision like how much should block rewards be? Should we use a different consensus algorithm? How should the algorithm evolve? Or if you have a smart contract platform, how should the gas costs be? Should you try having a different VMs? All of these decisions are going to impact a lot of people, and they present trade-offs. And you need to have some sort of decision-making procedure that lets you steer the users of the platform in one direction to say, okay, there are trade-offs, but overall, we're all better using the same system, and overall, we think that this better system is this version. So that's one aspect. And at a higher level, I think it's about incentives. So we've been living in a world where it's much more attractive for people to try and start their own blockchain project rather than contribute to an existing one. And part of that is that it's really hard to capture the benefit of innovation if you just apply innovation to an existing system. And so you see this, people want to just start a new token rather than say like, hey, I'm going to bring all this innovation to this existing blockchain. And governance is a way also of addressing that by saying like, hey, if you bring innovation to this blockchain, there's a procedure where you can be rewarded for doing this.
So like different blockchain governance processes like offer more or less, hope to contributors to actually get changes through. I think a lot of the reason people start new coins actually is because of the, I think, incredibly harmful norm of fixed supply cryptocurrencies. That means that the people who get in first are way over rewarded. And so everyone basically just goes and starts a fixed supply cryptocurrency so that they can get in first, because that's where this incentive skewed. Even though your cryptocurrency is somehow, because of the network effects, less likely to succeed if it's new.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this kind of like brings to like, I guess one of the big questions of like, classes of users. Like traditionally when people talk about like governance and processes, the main classes to me, what I tend to see is like you have the operators of the network, which is what I call my word for like miners or the stakers or whatnot. The users and then the miners, those tend to be like the three main categories.
You said the miners twice.
Oh, sorry. The developers, yes. And so it seems to me that one of the problems with the developers is that like, there's no, the miners actually earn more tokens while the developers don't naturally earn more tokens, and all they can do is increase the value of their existing tokens.
Well, I mean, meaning you didn't see that in like Bitcoin, but like, Ethereum, there was some pre-mine for the foundation. In Zcash, there's a issuance for the developers. Remember like,
but then doesn't that?
I think the first coin that did a dev coin back in like 2012 or something, 2013.
Well, what about like this fact that you like create this incumbent dev team who's the only one who's motivated?
Yeah, so there's definitely governance issues around the software repositories and the development processes, and especially as it relates to the protocol specification and stuff like governing the protocol, especially. So here's like the kinds of things we're talking about, right? Like imagine if the developers make a change to the protocol just to enrich themselves, or make a change to the protocol as a result of a bribe. So like if there's not good processes somehow, it's possible, or if there's not good norms and processes, then you can have situations where there's definite conflicts of interest that end up leading to stakeholders being taken advantage of. Yeah,
and I think it's important to understand what is the dynamics that happens when you have a change of protocol. And so if you implement your change of protocol as a hard fork, you create potentially two versions of one coin. And when you have that, most of the economic value is going to be captured by one token and not by the other. And it's determined by a Schelling point. It's like the one that seems legitimate, the one that seems to be like the right one, is going to capture most of the economic value. And if you see most of around most forks, if you look at the ATC-ETH fork, all the ATC rhetoric was around like, no, there's the original one. Look, because we didn't change the rules. And the same thing with Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin Cash saying Bitcoin Cash is Bitcoin. So it's really, really about the legitimacy. And the problem with legitimacy is that it can be like, you could have the legitimacy and still be a bad fork. Like it's completely possible that, like Vlad says, you take a bribe, you do something bad in the code, but hey, it's actually, despite that, unless it's extremely egregious or visible, despite that, it's the version that people think is legitimate. And so that's why I think that as a governance procedure, if you just say like, hey, we're going to follow the hard forks, you give too much clout to possibly development teams or other external factors.
Interesting, yeah. So to me, actually, like with hard forks, we have a bigger hope of removing any kind of defaults. Where basically with things because basically like you can have user flags, where they have to have the flag set one way or the other. As opposed to having, like in kind of Tezos, a kind of in-protocol signal that sets the default.
Yeah,
the defaults really can completely dominate if especially if there's been a precedent a few times of just following the defaults.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think what we do in Tezos is that we flip the thing on its head, which is that if you don't want to upgrade, you're the one who has to change the code. So, the default is to follow the upgrade. But if you don't like it, you're the one who's hard forking. I think the benefit. So, and like Vlad said or hinted at earlier, you could move the shelling point off chain by having this off chain governance procedure and say, hey, we clearly all agree to do this hard fork, and then let's do this hard fork, without having it automatically applied by the algorithm. However, if you do that, I think it works at the beginning, but over time, once your protocol becomes adopted in more and more places, the do nothing default, I think, becomes a stronger shelling point than the follow the governance procedure default. And it might even be in the form of saying, hey, we have this software deployed in all these machines, and they have this fancy hard fork which breaks backwards compatibility. Therefore, we're not going to bother. We're just going to follow the old one. And then all of a sudden, you have all the ATMs, all the servers, all of this stuff which is using the old code, and they're not going to bother with your new version. And so that creates a very, very powerful default, unless you have auto upgrade functionality.
Yeah. So I think well, if nodes that really need it, they like say because they don't have a node operator, but they're operating in the wild, they could have an auto upgrade functionality. However, that should be seen as a software vulnerability, because if there's a compromise in the GitHub repo or someone releases something, it'll kind of automatically upgrade. The main problem I think with the on-chain shelling game is that I think that your ability to represent the various stakeholders is much worse than our ability to represent stakeholders off-chain. Because off-chain we have access to people who cannot provide a Sybil-resistant mechanism, a Sybil-resistant proof on-chain.
Well, okay, so then related to that, right? So one of the nice things actually about using this either coin holder based voting or miner based voting is it allows a way to do anonymous Sybil resistance. While if you start depending on these off-chain governance mechanisms, the only way to do Sybil resistance, node signaling isn't Sybil resistant. There are cases where people claim that people just running nodes on AWS.
Yeah, sure. But if Poloniex says what their policy is, or if Bitfinex says what their policy is for what node they're going to choose, that could be very. But
then the thing is though that once you remove this ability to be anonymous in your shelling game,
so that doesn't get removed. All miner signaling and coin signaling still exists. Just because we don't automatically have to follow it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen as a signaling method. People still will be able to say what their opinion is as a miner or a coin holder using a Sybil resistance.
So your suggestion. So what you're saying is that sort of you have these governance systems on chain, voting and carbon voting or whatever, but then you also have these off. So
they're more like a communication system. It's more like a signaling system.
Yes,
which maybe can help people coordinate around focal points, or around the decision that they like, as opposed to something that automatically helps or automatically determines what software a node will upgrade. So basically the question is what is the signal hooked up to?
Well, so what is someone's upgrade? So let's say they have in the node they have some they can set something that they use to upgrade to pull a new software, and you're saying what do they look at to do that?
And so they're going to use different sources of information, and there's kind of a difference between the node operator doing it and a smart contract and the consensus protocol doing it.
So everything has to be manual, essentially.
Yeah, it has to be kind of done by the operator's own policies.
So what about the fact that I don't know, I feel most users just literally just don't care.
Well, no, they do care. They want to be with their peers. They don't care about other than that. They just hope to be with their peers. That's all they really care.
So then isn't the easiest way to make sure that they're all with their peers is make sure everyone sort of upgrades atomically, and then the people who don't want to do that.
Yeah, sure. So that'd be great. But how do you do that in a way that actually represents the interests of, for example, node operators?
Okay, so real quick question. Vlad, you're talking about like the concerns and motivations of stakeholders. I just wonder, can you define like who the stakeholders are in the system? Who are the people we really care about here?
Yeah, sure. So basically, the stakeholder is kind of defined as like anyone who is affected by the outcome. So it includes people who like run their businesses on the network, people who are just users, people who are affected just through like even indirect effects, like say if the blockchain creates public goods or public harms. They're also kind of considered stakeholders. So anyone who is affected by the resource is considered a stakeholder. The developers of applications, the developers of the protocol, the users, the coin holders, all the ERC20 holders, whatever.
Arthur, how do you define stakeholders? No, I think this definition is fine, but I think a lot of the interest of most of the stakeholders is captured by the token holders. Essentially, if you're a token holder and you care about your interests as a token holder, your interests, well understood, is that the system is useful and that there's many people on it and that the system is reliable and that people can count on it. And so if you understand your interests correctly, you're going to have the interests of most of the stakeholders that Vlad mentions at heart. I don't think there's a fundamental conflict. It's not 100% aligned, but it is very, very closely aligned.
That seems to make sense very well for like what I'd call like a store value blockchain, where like Bitcoin, where I feel like the holders are like almost by definition the stakeholders. But what about when we start to move to stuff like Ethereum, where let's say like as of now it's not the case yet. Let's say in a few years where like the primary usage and the users of Ethereum, they just hold a little bit of Ether just to pay their fees, but they're just primarily using ERC20 tokens. And now like the Ether whales are like and they have like a incentive. Their incentive is to like get as much transaction fees as like usage of transaction fees as possible and stuff. And that seems like a very clear case of like the native token holders misalignment with the
other users of the platform.
Yeah, but the thing is, if they start doing that, then people are going to move to platform with lower fees. I think even a little bit of competition in the space is enough to put in check this type of monopoly pricing.
So how do you? So I mean, my hypothesis is that like look, even a bit of uncompetitiveness means that this kind of pricing will happen to some extent. Okay, how would you say that like we could measure the kind of effect of the competitiveness, so somehow the effect of the competitive competition between blockchains on the incentives of stakeholders? I mean,
it's not just competition with other blockchains. It's just that you can piggyback off of a block. If the fees on a blockchain are too high, you can piggyback. You can basically create side channels, state channels. There's many ways where you can piggyback off this blockchain and stop paying like really high fees if it's being very inconvenient. So I don't think there's a whole lot of pricing power here.
Okay, so maybe not even then just in terms of pricing power. I mean, I guess the more general question is like, in terms of bad governance decisions, do we think blockchains really are competitive enough that people can, just make the move and switch if things get bad? Or is that an unrealistic assumption, I guess? Because, if we decide it is an unrealistic assumption for people to switch, then like, we've got to be more careful because we can get locked into like pretty bad situations pretty quickly.
It would be, so somehow it's harder to fork away from the default than to fork to something new. So anyways, the defaults are sticky, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, so I mean, like in our original Conspiratus blog, our first article was about Tezos, and we kind of like argued about governance a bit. And the analogy that I actually made was that governance, like we should compare it to like real world governments, where we generally allow governments to proceed without needing everyone's involvement every single time. And then once a government fails or it does something atrocious, then you have a revolution or a secession. But the thing is, the issue is in the real world, revolution and secession usually comes with war and it's bloody and messy, while the ability for hard forking allows much easier secession and revolution than in the real world. And so the question is, like, do we think then, like Nate basically said, is like, how do we like try to estimate the cost of creating hard forks?
Well, Vitalik had a nice blog post about it a while ago, where there's a cost and a benefit, right? Because there's more like diverse consumer needs being filled, but a cost to the network effect loss, and depending on the different kind of utilities there, or it might be a benefit or a loss. I don't remember the details, but
interesting. One thing that it seems like kind of the main distinction that you guys disagree on is this kind of idea of what the default should be. And kind of, it seems to me like the argument, Arthur, that you're making for why the default should be, go with the network is kind of like twofold. It's first, like, you just want to be with your peers. So it's kind of, the point is that it's kind of easiest this way, right? There's kind of efficiency gains to be had in terms of the process of upgrading. If we kind of just say, just go with your peers by default. Vlad, do you think that there's something to be said in terms of efficiency gains? Like, what makes you so sure that the efficiency gains that we, get from this really formal on-chain automatic governance process aren't greater than,
I don't think the bottleneck in governance in practice isn't really the efficiency of upgrades as much as the deliberation around what changes are appropriate. So I don't really think it's actually the bottleneck. And my fear is that getting rid of the default or making the default to follow will remove an important check and balance that the blockchain has today, which is namely the manual kind of processes of the node operators.
Okay, another question about the node operators, right? So one thing that I, kind of going back to a question I asked quite earlier on about like the anonymity side of things, right?
Yeah,
so
this is great, yeah.
Right, and so for example, there have been, what do you think about the claim that there was a lot of SegWit2x supporters who were too scared to speak out, which might account for that like sudden Bitcoin Cash spike as soon as SegWit2x failed? Like, I know I've personally tweeted a pro 2x tweet and then I got kind of scared and I deleted my tweet.
Yeah, so right. So I mean, so that's actually the beautiful thing about node governance is that it's completely anonymous and there's no voting, no signaling, no counting really at all. Posting on Twitter actually isn't you acting as a node operator; it's you acting as a community.
I mean, I also run a Bitcoin Classic node.
Yeah, sure. So, but running the node is something that you don't need to tell anyone about, and you can do, and doesn't involve a subordinate measure at all, right? And so you can't really tell by looking at what nodes are seeing on the network that reliably.
But that's not civil.
Well, exactly. But the point is that it's not about getting a signal of what people are doing. It's about people independently making a decision about what to install, right? And so actually and somehow it's quite elegant that we get to have a governance process where we don't actually need to tally the votes at all, but we get to have the decision be enforced in a distributed way by all sorts of different governance processes about governing different nodes.
Do you think there is an option to add some sort of like, heuristics to nodes, like, economic weight?
Sure, but if you did it in the protocol as opposed to it being done by the process of the node operator,
right,
then I would be much more concerned, right, because it would be kind of less decentralized in a way, and because everyone who is running a node has this Schelling point now, which is just to follow the protocol, and so they don't need to actually do as much active coordination.
The thing is like, I think that by the time you're an operator and you decide what node you're going to install and what you're going to run, I think the decision is already over. Like, the decision is already made for you. The decision even, happens before the hard fork. Like,
I mean, I don't think that's always clear, right? That's not always clear. I mean, for example, the Daugaard fork, it wasn't that clear.
Which one was going to win?
Yeah.
With the going to be cluster? I don't know. For me, it was obvious that the one with the original dev team and all of this stuff was going to be the winning one, just because the Schelling point was so strong. But
yeah, I feel like the one that the Ethereum Foundation supported.
Yeah, but somehow the Ethereum Foundation didn't really take sides. It was, and even the devs at the foundation were kind of split on it. But I kind of agree with you that the Schelling point was stronger on the support DAO fork. But I was definitely insecure about the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess it's like, yeah, we don't have a whole lot of data points in this space for this kind of things happening. But I think that before most forks, even before the Bitcoin Cash or SegWit2x, it was pretty clear which branch was going to have the economic cluster.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Sure.
That's something you could predict based, just based on inertia, just based on like people just saying, I'm going.
And so
But it is actually super useful. For example, when like Bitfinex or Poloniex says what their policy is for what they're going to list under what name.
Oh yeah. They have a whole lot of power. Although they use this power, but then they can. I forgot which was, but I think Coinbase, kind of uses power by saying like we're going to support this, but it's like had they committed to 2x or something like that, and then they said like, well, actually we don't know. So there's a bit of. I compare hard forks to a game of chicken. Essentially each side wants to say, no, we're going to go with that side, and we'll just like take all our tokens from the other fork and we'll sell them, and we'll just keep this one, and we're just like completely committed to this one. Mm-hmm. But if you do that and you're not sure that you're actually going to capture most of the economic cluster, you're going to crash your car. So there's a lot of bluffing that's involved in doing.
So like in a talk probably 6 months ago or something, Arthur, you said something along the lines of, I'd like to think of a hard fork like a revolution. And Vlad, in a kind of a similar talk, at least on governance, kind of makes a very clear distinction between a revolution and like secession, which is what he thinks of a hard fork. And I'd love to like explore, like, Arthur, maybe why do you think of it like a revolution? And Vlad, why do you draw that distinction?
So I'll start quickly. I think of it as a revolution mostly because a hard fork doesn't really have a split between two parts of the communities. I think one branch always wins. I don't think the problem with a hard fork is that it splits your network effect. I think the problem with a hard fork is that the branch that you take is not necessarily the branch that is the best branch to take. That's the main concern. Like historically, hard forks typically, there's not a whole lot of examples, but if I think of like ETC and Bitcoin Cash, they're like 10%. And certainly most of the economic value is going to be captured by one. So you can think of it as a revolution, and I know it's not a hard, I know it's not really a hard fork, but you can think of it as a revolution, but it's mostly, you can think of it as a decision, but mostly it's just, one big decision for the main economic cluster, and you end up with a small economic cluster. But so far, we haven't seen a hard fork or a split of communities where the two become really, really big. Maybe we'll see it with Bitcoin Cash because they're pushing a lot. They're certainly pushing a lot behind it. So that remains to be written. But haven't seen it so far.
Maybe we just haven't I feel like we also just haven't seen that many contentious hard forks. Like, I mean, really, Bitcoin Cash and Ethereum Classic, I guess, are kind of like the really only major ones.
But, there's lots of hard forks that, don't represent any changes in the governance process at all, right? I mean, so there's like most successful hard forks, aren't disruptive to the governance of the repository, aren't disruptive to the governance. Only really contentious hard forks are disruptive to governance processes. Or maybe they might not even be also, right? Mm-hmm. And the secession really has to do with setting up an alternative governance process and saying, look, I don't want to, and trying to kind of build an alternative competing, hopefully to like an alternative process for governing the repo, which you hope will be more legitimate one day, which is kind of like Bitcoin Cash and Ethereum Classic's dream, right? They kind of hope that their governance processes will be more legitimate than, and they believe they are more legitimate, right, than Bitcoin and Ethereum's.
Would you say that Bitcoin Cash is based around this like governance process idea?
Yes, there's the stakeholders of Bitcoin Cash have been disenfranchised by Bitcoin Core's governance process and have set up a new one which they feel will represent their interests.
I see. And so, but do you agree with Arthur's claim that, like, given this split, that like it will always be one winner out of the two? Or?
Well, I mean, I think it's very unlikely that there's going to be a tie.
Sure. Okay.
Do you think it's likely to get a 30-60, 30-70 split?
No, I think we're talking power laws, and so it's more likely to be like, 99-1, 95-5.
What is Ethereum Classic right now? Like,
I don't know, like probably like worse than 90-10, like for Ethereum Classic.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I think we could say that the DAO hard fork ended up being relatively successful.
Completely successful. Although I think the main problem with the DAO hard fork was the lack of replay protection.
Okay, so wasn't the onus on the Ethereum foundations, like the Ethereum chain, to add replay protection?
Well,
I mean,
it's not that simple. I mean, there's like limited dev resources and limited time, and it was definitely something that like I pushed for and other people pushed for, but the developers didn't think that it was worth the additional, because it's a significant code change, right? It changed the number of lines for the hard fork, increased it a lot.
Okay, so
and the probability that it would have broken something was I mean, the risk of the hard fork having a technical failure would have been quite higher.
I see. Okay, so if we could go back, if you would have preferred to, like, you know, if the Ethereum Foundation could have pushed, like, maybe it would have to have been delayed a little bit, but like really get that.
Yeah, and the issue was that, like, if there was like one more delay that was possible, but it would have made the hard fork more complex also because of the DAO fund movement.
Mm-hmm. Arthur, sorry to like put you on the spot on this, but like, I don't know, what are your opinions on the DAO hard fork?
Yeah, I wish it had the replay protection, but there was this smart contract where you could like split your fund, and that was very, I thought that was very clever. Mm-hmm. But overall, I don't have a strong. Let's see, I don't have a strong opinion on whether or not it was the right thing to like take the funds back from the DAO. I can see like reasons to do it and reasons not to do it. So here's what first is like, I don't believe in the ideas that like, nope, this is exactly what the contract says. Therefore, you know, the funds are them. Like it's, you know, it's not a theft and free and clear. No, I think it is fundamentally theft or attempted theft that happened. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, when people enter a contract, there's certain expectations, and the expectation here is like, you know, it's it's like, you know what I mean, okay? And that was not what the contract was meant to do. That's not what people understood. And so, if you just think about it for a second, it's pretty clear that it's not okay to do that. Mm-hmm. You know, would you be comfortable telling your mom that, hey, I took all this money from these people, and like, yes, they intended to because they put this recursion bug, and that was, you know, their entire purpose in doing this, but then they would get money. Now, the reasons for not hard forking would be more in the realm of like, hey, we don't want to set a precedent, because if you set a precedent, then maybe people become less careful when they create smart contracts, because they say like, oh well, you know, we can always hard fork. Or maybe what you're saying is like the state of the blockchain is on the table, and if you put it on the table, then all of a sudden it's like, well, you know, if that's on the table, then what else is, as opposed to pure technical changes. So it possibly opens a Pandora box. There's the idea of shelling fences. So a shelling fence is like where it's kind of an arbitrary stop point, but that you put so that you don't have a slippery slope, right? And it's not clear for me where the shelling face is. It's like, you know, what should you do? So one shelling fence that I think is interesting is whether or not the tokens change hand. So if you look at something like the Parity wallets, like hack or bug, not the hack, but the bug where like all the funds are inaccessible. Right. So in this case, funds haven't changed hands. And so if you have a hard fork that says like, hey, you know, in this hard fork, we introduce a contract which has exactly this hash and recovers the fund, it's not messy. However, if funds have changed hands, then I think I would place the shelling face before. So overall, I would lean towards not doing it, but you know, I'm not a rabbit in my opinion over this.
Mm-hmm. In in Fred Eshrom's like article, he has like this like he mentioned how Dfinity is actually like, you know, even proposes the idea of being able to like retroactively change things of the blockchain stage for like, there's a little like picture, like a cartoonish picture of like a sample of what a proposal queue could look like, and I noticed one of the things on there said like freeze 0x sub account and like said like pornography market, and like the idea of like, you know, having the ability to like, this is kind of censorship in a way, right? And should like governance have the ability to censor and
well, so basically there's kind of a couple of kind of relevant points. One of them is like, okay, fundamentally, if everyone who runs nodes coordinates, they can censor. But on the other hand, the question is, okay, what should the governance processes and norms be, right? And that's actually the main way that I would judge a lot of these things, is in terms of how they impact and play into the governance norms and processes, right? So to me, like, if the governance process is not easy to game by adversaries, or for an adversary to push through censorship, but it's only something where somehow it's something that stakeholders represents the stakeholders' interests, gets through, then somehow that's the best of both worlds, where basically changes get through that represent stakeholder interests, but when they don't, they don't get through. Somehow that's like abstract, right? In practice, it can be a little more complicated because stakeholders will have conflicting interests at different times.
Yeah.
And you might not ever find optimal choices or whatever. But at the end of the day, the question about where the like shelling fence should be, or to me it's a matter of the process as opposed to particular rules of thumb. I think like through the process there should be kind of basically that you will follow a process and that'll set some precedents, and then those generally will be like what people use to learn about how the process works. This is kind of self-reinforcing norms that end up forming.
So what do you think about the idea of like so on Cosmos, we're actually building, we have for our governance, we have like a very coin holder driven governance model, but we also have a constitution. And what do you think about the role of constitutions in like?
Well, so I'm assuming that by constitution you mean like, okay, instead of like principles or like some document that's meant to like give legitimacy to governance processes.
Yeah, it acts as like it's a legitimacy giver.
Yeah, I mean, I think depending on the extent to which the community actually identifies with the constitution, can be effective. I also think that it will kind of, if enough people uphold it, then it'll be like a kind of focal point, which will like I said, like probably create norms and expectations, which if they're good ones can help a lot and impact things in a positive way, but if you get it wrong can impact things in a negative way, right? So somehow the important thing to note about this type of thing is that small changes, small differences in the Constitution can make big impacts in the future. And so the actual norms that you have, may not seem that significant today, or you may not put much thought into them today, but will have like outsized effects in the future.
So what you're suggesting then is that maybe a constitute, like trying to create these like shelling fences very early on, formalized in a constitution, may not be the best idea because we can't like predict the consequences.
Yeah, it might be risky, right? It might end up in a situation where you end up disenfranchising a bunch of stakeholders because this norm that was adopted earlier ended up not being suitable for like later situations. Like for example, the no hard forks, the rule in Bitcoin.
Yeah, the no hard fork rule in Bitcoin is weird. I'm still trying to understand the thing is like you can package any Bitcoin hard fork inside a soft fork, and Peter Todd has a great article explaining how you do it. You just had a special transaction, which is a hash of something else that you publish, which contains completely different rules.
No, but they actually don't. They don't really advocate it if it changes the validation too much.
I know, but the distinction seems a little. I don't know. I like SegWit, but I thought that it felt a little convoluted. As a way to shoehorn it into a soft fork. The thing I wanted to say, it's not just about governance. There's a security aspect to these things. So in Tezos, you mentioned Dfinity wants to retroactively change the state. In Tezos, it's also possible, like through the governance procedure, to change balances. You can say like, hey, here's a new protocol upgrade, and by the way, the tokens that were in this account are now in this account. And as much as possible, I would like to make sure to avoid that, not just on a cultural level, but also on a code level. If it's at all possible to say to prove that your upgrade only affects consensus algorithm and this type of things and doesn't affect balances and the state, that would be tremendously helpful. And it's difficult because you could do things like, no, I don't change the balances. I just introduce a new type of transaction. And when you make this type of transaction, this is the consequence it has. So it's tricky to do. But the reason I want to do it isn't so much that I think that changing the state by itself is necessarily like always horrible, or that the governance decision would be bad, but you give people powers that maybe they don't want to have. And all of a sudden, maybe now they're open to threats, maybe now they're open to bribery. Because if you're running a node and someone says like, I don't like that my transaction went through, I want you to vote to remove it. I want you to use governance in order to do that. Then you create a system that can potentially be corrupted. And so as much as possible, you want to remove power around the sensitive things so that the changes are more about algorithms and maybe like high level fees and this type of things, but not something as clear cut as like, I had tokens, now you have tokens.
Yeah, so I mean, along that line then, so one thing then is that in Tezos, you kind of have like sort of one sort of governance proposal where it's like, this is the OCaml code that defines the next state of the protocol. One thing we're doing in Cosmos is we're creating these like different classes of proposals, where there's one kind of proposal that's called a parameter proposal. And so there are certain things that are like, they're in the parameters such that, if once the governance proposal goes through, like it gets auto updated on all the validator nodes. And then we have what's called a software upgrade proposal, which requires like validators to install and users to install new software altogether. And the thing is, we can actually use this distinction in a way where, like, for example, we don't want to put, technically, it wouldn't be like technically difficult to add token issuance to like validators as a parameter, but we don't want to do that because we don't want to make it too easy to do that. And so we just don't add it as a parameter. Like if they really want to change the token issuance, they could go do a software upgrade, but like having these different classes creates different like levels of like difficulty on like pushing them through.
Yeah, no, I agree. And in fact, the whole voting procedure in Tezos is not something that's like agile enough to like change parameters very often. It's just a way to bootstrap into governance. But one of the first proposals that I'd like to make is to take some parameters. You just say, okay, we know that this parameter is safe within this range, and now we're going to delegate like changes to these parameters to a small group of people who can make a signature, and that can make very nimble governance decision within those like restricted set of parameters and within those restricted intervals. That way you can have some agile changes that happen here without putting the system at risk. So as much as possible, I would like to decouple the governance procedure so that a governance event in Tezos is not just everyone votes for a new code, the code gets compiled and get voted, because that's very cumbersome. But it can it can be cut up to pieces progressively.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, one question I'd like to ask is like, what are some like useful classifications or adjectives, for example, that we can use to sort of classify governance protocols, like terms like formalized, centralized, coin holder driven, like. What are the maybe axes or adjectives? Like, how can we like try to model like classify in order to like get an idea behind different protocols?
Well, I have some ideas. So the main kind of question is how many software repositories are there, and how are they governed and synchronized? Mm-hmm. And how are the nodes governed and synchronized? Right. And then also I think it makes sense to ask about the trademark also.
I see.
And those are kind of like the basic things. And then you could compare them by like thinking about basically the node operators. Basically, there's kind of two models that are popular right now. Mm-hmm. One of them is like, you follow like social media and like whatever to keep up to date with the change to the repository, mm-hmm. or there's an on-chain governance process that says here's the chain, mm-hmm. here's the proposed change. In terms of the software changes, that's more of a question of like, is it open source software practices? Is there more of like a centralized development team with like a single project manager? Like what is basically there? That's more of like a software project management kind of question. Sometimes there's also this question about like, oh, how does community input happen? How does it relate to maybe a specification? So I don't know how easy it is to represent that on an axis.
How would you describe how community input happens in Ethereum?
Well, there's the Ethereum improvement proposals process where you can post your EAP ideas or ERCs, or there's a bunch of different types of proposals. And then there's some curation that happens, and if you get the right combination of secret sauce, the all devs call will consider the EAP, and then it might make its way into the implementation.
Is this
not all EAPs actually need to go to the all devs call, only changes to the protocol actually do it, right? ERCs are just implemented and used by the community kind of without any kind of explicit need for it to become part of the schedule for the all devs meeting.
So for this all devs call, what do you can you describe a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. It's like a bi-weekly call every second Friday, right? Where the core developers of all the main implementations of Ethereum get together and decide on the short-term release schedule. And they come to pretty much unanimous consensus every time by like procrastinating things that are contentious. The only example when it wasn't the case is the DAO hard fork, where there wasn't agreement, which is why we had this, which is one of the reasons why they had and they settled on the whole user activated hard fork where you have to set the flag.
Are these all dev calls open?
Yeah, they're all recorded and public, and there's also minutes that you can
but also
read.
like let's say I'm working on a client implementation of my own, right?
Oh yeah, sure. So if it's synchronized with the consensus, I think that like entitles you to open these calls.
Arthur, what do you think about like the concept of like the reference clients versus no reference client, right? So like Ethereum kind of follows like to an extent that it was formally specified in the yellow paper, and then you kind of have somewhat of a reference client in Geth, but like Parity does have enough of a market share that like kind of evens it out. But while in Tezos, it's kind of like the idea is that the primary OCaml implementation is like the source of truth. Like you can go ahead and make another client if you want, but if it forks off, like that's your problem, right? So what do you think about like what was the design decision that went into there and thinking there?
Okay, so I'll tell you the ideal situation. The ideal situation is that you have a complete mathematical model, formal model of your algorithm, and then you have an implementation with certification, so like a formal proof of correctness. And then if you do that, it doesn't even matter if you have a second implementation because it's proven correct. But you know what? Maybe there's a bug with your compiler or something like that. So you can have multiple implementations and they're all proven correct with respect to this document. That's the ideal world. So now less ideal, you do this, but instead of having like a completely formal description, you have a somewhat formal description in something like a yellow paper. And the difficulty here is that there may be some ambiguities which are left in the paper, and you don't have also a formal process to see if your implementations are exactly correct. Now, you can build test suits, you can do a lot of things, but there's a risk that they run that they diverge in their consensus. And so this happened with Parity and Get, but fortunately, the difference was that one just stopped and the other one continued, right? But if they had both continued on their branches, it could have been difficult. You could end up with some double spans and other issues. And if you look at like what's the risk of having a fork in your protocol and having to resolve that versus having a single implementation which maybe does something that's not the expected behavior, but at least does it consistently. And in the case of distributed ledgers, I think it's better to try to preserve the consistency of the ledger rather than to try to have these multiple implementations. And then last but not least, the way we define a protocol in Tezos is as a piece of OCaml code. So we can have a different implementation of the network shell. So the entire peer-to-peer layers that like takes transactions. And I think we should, and that's something I would like to work on if there's funding for it. But the actual protocol itself, the one that says like, okay, I have a block. What's my new state? That's a piece of OCaml. Now, fortunately, most of the bugs that you can expect are probably going to be on the outer shells, because that's very stateful. You deal with a bunch of peers, you deal with a bunch of transactions, there's a lot of things that can happen, whereas the protocol itself is can be pretty small and can be well self-contained, is written in a purely functional manner. So this piece of OCaml code ends up pretty close to a formal specification.
So okay, I guess let's going back a little bit then to the Bitcoin question. So Vlad, you're what you've kind of hinted to as your like ideal governance process seems pretty much very similar to what Bitcoin actually already does, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, only imagine with governance norms that weren't so toxic.
So what I guess going off that, like, what do you think like went wrong in Bitcoin?
Well, I think the main thing that went wrong was the no hard forks thing. Okay. The kind of no contentious hard forks thing, I think, was a kind of big mistake in a number of ways, both because, it doesn't mean it means they can't really go to proof of stake and sharding, and also because it means they can't increase block sizes or do all sorts of things that like may become necessary one day. They kind of have, they basically really
they did increase the block size.
The religion of it, right? They really believe that Nakamoto consensus is like it forever. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people kind of were disenfranchised by that governance process.
I remember you wanted this governance process of Bitcoin being like idolizing academic pedigree. And can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I wouldn't call it academic pedigree necessarily, but mm-hmm. but technical expertise and time spent working on Bitcoin at a certain kind of level.
Uh-huh.
I think culturally it stems from like what you believe is necessary to be relevant in 10 years. And if you think that's what's necessary to be relevant in 10 years is that you've added all these innovations and you have a very high throughput of transactions and you're doing all these like great things, then you need to have like either hard forks or governance procedure. You need to be able to move. But the other view is that the way you're relevant in 10 years is because you've survived. And the idea of like having no hard fork and Nakamoto consensus and that's it, to its credit, it's a norm that's very, very resilient because it's not going to be subject to drift. You don't risk drifting away to something that becomes irrelevant. You're like, we've had this, it's worked so far. Maybe everything just ends up dying because it just go in random directions, but we just stick with this and this is how we survive. And I think that explains the difference in opinion and culture around the governance.
So let's talk about trademarks a little bit then, I guess.
Sure.
So things like Bitcoin, where like the name isn't defined, like what is the definition of Bitcoin? Is it by definition the chain that has the Genesis block and has the most hash power? If Bitcoin Cash in 6 months has more collective cumulative proof of work, does it become Bitcoin? And how does this idea compare to the trademark policy of someone like Zcash, where the Zcash company or foundation, I don't remember which one, but one of the two actually owns the name Zcash.
I'll just point out that at some point Ethereum had more hash power than Bitcoin, and so Ethereum is was for a short period of time the real Bitcoin, according to the definition of hash. There's Bitcoin maximalism and there's hash power maximalism.
But it didn't have the Genesis.
Pushing it very far.
No, it didn't have the right Genesis block, but if you talk to certain maximalists, you don't even need the Genesis block because you just check mm-hmm. You just check any proof of work chains. but anyways. Somehow, if the trademark isn't legally owned and can't be legally enforced by some entity that kind of owns it and can use the trademark system, then it's going to be enforced by a kind of coordination around the symbol via norms in a distributed kind of fashion. Where basically people will kind of have to argue it out when things get contentious, but for the most part, there's just going to be something that sticks because there's a coordination cost reduction if everyone agrees on what to call things. Mm-hmm. And so what will end up happening is, people with important interfaces that list, mm-hmm. the coins, maybe exchanges, block explorer, .org, bitcoin.com, these types of things will decide individually what their processes are for doing it. But also they're going to be doing it in a way that kind of, at least in theory, should represent their own. It should represent their own stakeholders. And what ends up happening is that their users will end up complaining, right? There was like a lot of complaints against Coinbase, I think, for supporting some of these non-core Bitcoins.
So actually, one thing that I think would be cool to end on, I think it'd be cool for you guys to have like 1 minute to have the floor to speak to the Conspiratus viewers with your what's your last minute pitch on blockchain governance? What are your thoughts? What do you want to leave the viewers with?
Today, every modern software has auto-update. Your browser, your OS has auto-update. And the way it works is that the vendor is going to send you a new version and you're going to sign it and you install it. And that's a very common feature. If you want to do that with a decentralized system, you cannot have a single party sign it. And so you need to have some sort of collective signature that comes from everyone using the system. And that is essentially a governance procedure. So the idea is to say, let's use collective power of the users of the blockchain and the token holders in order to decide how we want to evolve. And that's a way where to bring in innovation while having the least disruption as possible to the blockchain.
Thanks.
So I would say that like generally blockchain governance processes are about managing the resources of the blockchain, basically the software that runs on the various nodes. And I think that like the kind of most important thing to kind of realize that it's a coordination problem between like many participants that affects many stakeholders, and coordination games are structured by the fundamental kind of nature of the things that you're coordinating around and the decisions around them, and also about the norms and processes that everyone uses to coordinate. And those kind of norms, like governance norms, are having very large impacts on the outcome of governance processes, even if they have the same kind of structure. So I think that like the kind of most important at the end of the day thing for the legitimacy and effectiveness of blockchain governance is for the processes to be, kind of fair and representative, and for the norms to be kind of healthy, whatever that means.
Cool.
Awesome, guys. Thanks so much for coming on. We really appreciate you guys taking the time.
Love to have you guys on maybe in the future again, and like maybe.
Sounds good.
Let's have it. Let's do it. Tezos, after Tezos' first governance proposal.
That would be very interesting.
Let's do it.
I have my first governance proposal for Tezos to switch to German consensus.
Cool. Welcome everyone to the first Conspiratus podcast debrief. This is some time Sunny and I take after every podcast, or we're planning to take after every podcast, to kind of discuss how the podcast went, how we felt about what was discussed, and some kind of key takeaways for us.
Yeah, so I mean, just reflecting on this, our guest clearly had a lot of different opinions on a lot of stuff, but I was actually quite surprised as to how much they agreed on. I think we all came to decent consensus on a lot of like common vocabulary, and we all kind of agreed on like what the issues are and the things we needed to solve. But at the same time, it was also pretty interesting to see like where they differed as well.
Yeah, I think for me, probably the most interesting difference is how they think about defaults and hard forks, right? So it seems like Vlad's opinion is that, in the case of a hard fork, the default for everyone should be no fork. And if you want to make a change, you have to, manually download software yourself. And Arthur kind of took the exact opposite approach in that, if on-chain protocol governance says we're going to do a fork, then, everyone by default downloads that and goes along with it. But I think was a really interesting distinction between the two of them.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know, where do you seem to lie on this? Because for me, I actually agree with Vlad on his like claim that like most users just care about being with their peers. And to me, the logical way of like having people stay with their peers, especially where people who aren't that like, active in the process, is like just have them automatically upgrade, and only the people who are actively against like the upgrade can go ahead and hard fork. But I know that you kind of disagree on that as well.
Yeah. So I guess I'd make 2 points. The first one is that I think anyone who really is that apathetic probably isn't going to be running a node. It's not trivial to run a node. And I think anyone who's, so apathetic that they can't bother themselves to download new software, even though everyone else is doing it, is probably a very select small class of user. And so I'm not really so worried about that.
Uh-huh.
And I think in general, this kind of argument of, oh, we'll get efficiency gains if we kind of just put everyone together by default. Kind of, as Vlad made a really good point, I thought, that I'd never really thought of before, and that the bottleneck in governance isn't really at the downloading the software part, right? It's everything else around that, kind of coming to the agreement, and even more than that, implementing the changes, right? That's usually kind of the main issue in the case of even, just regular protocol upgrades. I think that's where the bottleneck is. And so I think in most cases, we're not going to solve that problem. We're not going to fix that bottleneck. More so what we're going to do is, disenfranchise all of the node operators, which, maybe we disagree about how important they are, but I kind of think that they are engaged and they are important just because they're the ones running the software.
Yeah, and it seems that like one of Arthur's main things, like, he talked a lot about this idea of like this using Schelling points to figure out which way governance is going to go. And one of his key like efficiency gains that he was trying to go for is like eliminate a lot of the stakeholders from the governance process, but by making the assumption that the coin holders actually share the incentives and have the best interests of all the other stakeholders in mind. And like, I guess this is like, I'm not quite certain yet, like how true this model is. Like, I, in my opinion, I think that in every blockchain and cryptocurrency that we've seen up till now, I think that generally tends to be true. But like, the use cases of blockchain as they shift away from like currency and money, maybe that assumption will change over time. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah, I think so. I think he might make the distinction that, it's not that he's eliminating stakeholders from the, governance process, is that they're implicitly included through the coin holders thing.
Yeah,
but I think I also agree with you. Yeah. I think I totally agree with you in that, it might be semi-true as of now, but I think if we really do achieve our goal of, these general purpose, maybe not everyone agrees this is our goal, but kind of these generally used blockchains that kind of have actual users on them and not just people who, hold cryptocurrency and just kind of chill out. I think we might kind of see a divergence in interests where, users want one things and coin holders want another. And in that case, coin holder based governance doesn't represent who we want to represent.
Yeah, I guess this is a matter of like seeing how the industry starts laying out, because especially if you have like more application specific blockchains, it maybe goes a different way. So what do you think about the whole idea that like Arthur's claims about it being very easy for users to switch between blockchains, and like how strong do you think like this competition between different competing blockchains is?
Yeah, that's a great question. Here's what I'll say to all our listeners. If you hold cryptocurrency, how well could you imagine, selling all of one of your cryptocurrencies and switching over to another one, right? It's just it seems very tribalistic as of now. And it seems like there's some amount of lock-in to me. And I'm not sure, at least as of now, I buy this, competition between blockchains. If governance kind of sucks, you'll switch elsewhere thing. The other thing I want to point out though is that, this point, much like our last one, could be something that evolves over time. And it could be that, as our blockchains get more mature, it's kind of much easier to kind of migrate from blockchain to blockchain. But I guess we'll see.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot of interesting stuff in the podcast. Although, I mean, one of the things I was kind of actually a little bit disappointed about was we actually had a lot of other interesting stuff in our reading that we didn't really like get a chance to like cover in the podcast. So I think one of the big ones that we actually didn't get a chance to get to was like talking about voter participation rates, because like in a lot of things if you ever read about like the Daugaard fork, one of the biggest like critiques or big questions about like how such a small percentage of Ether was actually participated in the carbon vote. I just want to get your thoughts and like what do you think about this kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think I think there's a lot of area to explore in terms of like the voter participation rates. Arthur made some point in some talk he gave a while ago about automatic delegation, and and I think this is something Tendermint might have also, where you kind of can say, oh, I'll vote with this person or Cosmos, sorry.
Yeah, we have like a sort of like liquid democracy thing kind of going.
Yeah, it's an interesting model. it kind of says, more percent of the coins voting. And I would kind of also make the argument that it also definitely doesn't doesn't allow for any more input, right? So it's like, you can say, we have higher voter participation because, 1 million people voted, but if 1 million people are all just a single person pressing one button, the question kind of remains, how much real voter participation did you get? So, it's an interesting model. It's unclear to me how well it really represents the interests of the people who are voting, but,
yeah. I don't know if like all the readers got a chance to get to it. It was like the last thing on our reading list, kind of tucked away, but like, maybe if we didn't get a chance to consider and talk about like non-coin holder voting based governance models, like, futarchy.
So to some degree, I think futarchy is still kind of a coin holder based, governance voting model. It's just maybe a bit more complex. I think the distinction probably between futarchy and the governance systems we see as of now is that, here's like a futarchy is like, okay, let's create a prediction market for an outcome. Let's find some way of resolving that prediction market, to see if something was good or bad, and then, implement policies based on that. To some degree, you can kind of think about coin holder based governance as a very limited form of futarchies, in the sense that they kind of just say, we're assuming that, whether something is good or bad is tied up in the price of a token. And that's kind of what is resolving the market in the first place, right? So to some degree, I think that current coin holder based governance strategies are all pretty much just like very limited futarchies. And it might be interesting to kind of, there are issues that people bring up with them, and I think that's definitely valid. And I think to some degree, maybe they're a bit better, but still fall prey to many of the issues that, Vlad kind of talks about when he talks about on-chain governance.
Yeah, that actually reminds me, like we were talking the other day and you made this point about how like curation markets are actually this like sort of limited form of futarchies. And like, so it seems like you're actually making a similar claim about like coin holder governance is basically a futarchy without like a well-defined measurement mechanism. But yeah, I mean, I would love to. We're probably gonna. I'm sure we'll end up doing an episode on futarchy in the future. So let's save that for next time.
Cool. We'll jump into it then. All in all, I think this was a great first podcast. Obviously, I think I speak for both of us when I say, thank you, listeners. Obviously, we're still learning and kind of, getting our podcast chops, and we really appreciate you guys tuning in. And obviously, in the future, we're really looking forward to kind of improving, the questions we ask, the discussions we have, and obviously the production quality. So, thanks for sticking with us, and we hope you guys, got something out of it.
And and a bit of a teaser for next time. Our next episode is going to be on stable coins, and so stay tuned for that. And we'll be releasing the reading list for that within the next 2 weeks. So keep your eyes open. Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys. So stay frosty.